Now let's take a look at function. There's something related to function called the execution space control right here. But before we get into this, there's a value we can set within the method. Let's take a look at those values first. So there's some default options with the method, but I'll create a new one for now. Let's call this my function. And I'm going to remove this. So this function will run differently depending on where you call this. So for instance, if you call this function from the server, the function part will run. And I'll illustrate. Let me illustrate right here. So first of all, we have a server here, and we have a client here. Another client here. And the function that we are about to execute is right there, my function. And so here we have this server pushing out its logic. And then if the server suddenly calls my function at this point, it'll be calling the piece right here. So this function is called into the server here, back to the server. So we can say that the function was run on the server. Now, the clients here can also call the function. Right here, at this point, the function will be called. And if the client calls the function somewhere in this logic flow, the function will come in and give the output here. So it's like this, give the output here, and you call the function from here. So methods operate when they're called, and they can be called in different places, from the client, from the server, or in anywhere. But if you don't have the function option like this, the method is run where it's called. And the problem is that they will never know where they will be called, which introduces uncertainty to programming. So that's why we have something called the method settings, or the execution space settings. If you click on them, you can define the attributes of a method. And you'll see here an option to control the space in execution. That's why it's called space execution settings. You can select the option from these 6. So it's none. None means you execute it on both client and server. And here, server, client only, server only, multicast. But you don't have to care about for this now, and just think about what changes here. You can find more on this on the Developer Center with some explanation. And this is a visual from MSW. So if you want to run nothing, you select none. And you have the option to run on client only and so on. So, and the easy ones here would be for client only and server only. Because if the method is for client only, it will only run on a client. So in other words, even if it's called in the server, it won't run. So, and on the other end, a method with server only can only be called in the server. So even if a client tries to call it, the method won't run. So let's say I'm trying to manage the score here, and I'm going to reset it right here. Self the score equals, and we're actually going to end up with a funky operation. So this is set to run only on the server. And if I change this to client only, it will be only called on a client. So Now, do you remember what I've said about the session in logics? I said logics is mostly based on the server, which means it always runs in the back end. So most of the tasks you perform will come out from the server. So that's what you need to know on server only and client only. Now, let's take a look at other options. First of all, let's compare client and server. You're going to have to picture this in your mind. When I set the function execution space as client, I'm saying it has to run on a client. That sounds similar to client only, right? But there's a difference. Let's say a server is trying to call a server here. Server here is trying to call this function. And we're going to set this function to run on the client, not the server. So the server will automatically send a packet to the client here. They're sending this packet, and the client will receive the packet and run the function here. But when I set the function's execution space as server, even if a client calls the function here, it's supposed to send a packet so the server can run it. Take a look. The client calls a function here called f, and it won't run anything yet, but it's going to tell the server to run f. Then the server will run it. After messaging the server, the client will go on to do other things. It's going to execute the rest of the code. Let's say the function here prints out log a. So if you set the execution space as server, the client will tell the server to run the function here, and it will go on doing its job, such as executing log a and do something else. So if you want to run a function to run on the server, no matter where it's first called, you can select server instead of server only. And now the reverse is a little bit different. I said there's always only one server. But for clients, you can have more client. And let's say there's function f in the server. The execution space for f is set to client. So if a server calls it, it's going to tell each client to run f. You run f and you run f. And then the server will continue doing his job. But then the clients will receive the message and then process function here. And the traditional way of doing this was whenever the server calls f, they have to create a message right here saying blah blah blah, and the packet has to be created and stuff. Then it has to broadcast the packet to each of the clients so that they can run the function. But in MSW, they perform this sequence of actions in the execution space control. So you don't have to manually create the packets here and send them in a old school way. Okay, so we've just learned about client only, server, and server only. Then what's multicast? It's a bit unique. So no matter what the function does, it must be implemented somewhere to run. So the server usually runs the function while it sends messages to clients to run the function. But here, when there's a server, client and client. And when there's a function here, they send messages to run the function to the client. But if you want both of them to run it after all, that's when you use multicast. Let's take a look at an example. What was the rule again? So most logics are run on the server as a default. And of course, you can change the settings right here and let the function run on the client as well. If you want to do that, you can just turn this control off. But I don't recommend letting the logic flow from both sides because it gets very confusing when you have messages going back and forth. So it's best to run things on the server for the sake of simplifying. So let's try running begin play right here. What do you think will happen if we run this? For now, we selected server only, so it'll run on the server, right? And now let's create a function here. I'm going to create something for client only, client server only server, and one more multicast. And change each settings here. First, client, say log client, and client only. I'm gonna copy this and paste. Server and then server only, server only. Lastly, multicast. Cast. Okay. In order to call the functions here, you have to call it from on begin play. Here, to call a function, remember, you need this magic keyword self and a colon, and I'll try client only. And you need a parentheses. Okay. Oops, but you see this X icon here. It means that there is an error or it's impossible to run the code. This is because we're now in a server space. So MSW is trying to tell you that you cannot call a client-only object, a client-only method in a server space. So it's saying you won't be able to call it anyway. Yeah, so that's what the X means. So we're not going to get any results out of that. So let's try another one. Let's try self server only. Okay. Now here we can see a cloud icon. This means the function is meant for the server. So this part also says we're in the server. This means the function can run. Let's try run this thing. Okay, so you see begin play running first, and then it tells you here the space you're in. And we're in the server now, and we called this here. That's why the server only function is now executed. Now let's take a deeper look here. I'm going to set this. I'm going to just comment the rest out and set this as I'm going to call the server function right now. So you see a cloud icon with an arrow. So this means wherever you run this function, it will run on the server. It's the same with the client, self.client. Don't forget the parentheses here. you can see the arrow in this square icon. It's saying it'll run on the client. So remember, I always drew the server in a cloud shape and client in a square rectangle shape, right? So it's doing that right here. What do you think will happen if you run this function? Right now, we're in a server space. So if you call it in the server, this server function will be called here, right here. And if you call it in a client, this will be called in a server again. So the log here will tell you that it was called from the server again to the server. So as for this function is set in the client, it won't run in this space here. Instead, this code here will be sent to the client, and the log will tell you that it's gone from the client to client. So let's try running this. Yeah, so begin play and server code is executed. It's because of this. But for the client function, it's not executed in the server space, but it will be executed in the client space. So we cannot see it right now in the console since this is this begin play function only runs in the server. Okay, so assuming that you've understood, let's try switching gears. There is a timing issue here. I'm going to explain it later, but for now, I'm going to add 2 seconds right here and see what happens. Okay, now you can see the client printed in the console, right? So these 2 lines here are printed from the server, but this client is printed from the client. So this was the point where we sent it off to the client here. So let's try adding log here just to make it less complicated. I'll say, please execute this line when everything is done. So when you print this out, normally you should be seeing server and then client first, then end at last. But the order is slightly different here because, like I said, the server is going to do whatever it is in their next queue. So after handling these functions and sending it off to the client, the server will keep going on executing its code. So what you actually see will be this server part here, and then end first, then the client being executed. It's because here, our server will execute the first function, server function, and then send the client function to the client here. And then while the client is doing its work, it actually takes time here. The server will keep going on executing the next line of code here. So it was end coming up faster than client. And after this is done, after a few seconds, which was 2 seconds for us right now, the client function will be executed and will print out client. So the order is server first here and client second, but then it takes a bit of time, so this was a bit faster than this, so this comes second, and then third. So once the message arrives at the client, this is the order that the client will be printed out. Well, we cannot know, we cannot predict the timing of all three. We won't know what comes first and how long each of the steps will take. So you have to think about this carefully. You might think that one of them takes about 0.5 seconds, let's just assume. But that means with the slightest change in duration, you're going to get a totally different order of the outcome. So since you cannot predict the exact timing when the message would arrive, you need to take this into consideration when writing a code. So now let's try doing the multicast. The icon for multicast looks like this. I want to show you. It's taking long. Okay. Self multicast. Yeah, it's look like a paper plane. Anyway, when we click play, oh sorry, I forgot the parentheses. Okay, here you see the server printed first, begin play server multicast, and then the client multicast here. So it's a request being made to the client. So multicast is printed already once. The request has been made. Then the server runs, it's part of the multicast before sending the rest to the clients. So after running this multicast, the server keeps going on to run the other codes, and then the ones that the server sent to the client will be executed afterwards. So when the client gets the message from the client will print this. And it prints this message first because this will arrive first here. So this happens on a sequential order. And then the log is printed as multicast here because the multicast message has arrived. So far, so good. This can be a bit confusing when you try for the first time. It's a tricky concept, but in a nutshell, it's still the main flow coming out from the server. Server is always the main one. So if you can grasp that much, I think it should help you as you go forward.